Jules here. I have some thoughts I'd like to share. Please bear with me as I will be referencing my notes. I've been sending letters to elected representatives for the past couple of weeks, and in most cases I've received no response. However, my MP responded the night before last. He's a member of the so-called Progressive Conservative Party, and the response was exactly what I expected. Essentially a form letter that adopted an all lives matter stance and laid the blame for everything on Hamas. My friend and my partner both suggested keeping my response short and focusing on specific facts. My friend wisely pointed out that when someone doesn't care, you have to stick with facts, as that is what they deal in, which is sadly true and is essentially what I did. Even if Dr. Stephen Ellis won't listen, I want to share my original response here as I feel it needs to be said. We need to focus on and center the Palestinian journalists and media sources that are doing everything they can to share information about the genocide that is being enacted on their people by the Israeli government right now. But sadly, many people are not actively seeking out these voices and are relying on mainstream media and politicians to stay informed. These are incredibly biased sources, as evidenced by the actual account of recently released Israeli hostages versus what the media has reported. I have immense privilege as a white person, and I need to use my voice. I read a quote by Arundhati Roy that also reminded me of my responsibility to speak up. The trouble is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. This is everything I would say if I thought my MP would listen. Maybe you will. I hope so. What we are talking about here is not a debate regarding whether all lives matter, but a question of genocide and blatant war crimes. We are talking about an occupying military state that has cut off access to water, food, medical aid, and fuel from a population of over 2 million people, half of whom are children. Israel has controlled access to all of these resources since the Nakba in 1948. Instead of laying the blame with Hamas, I suggest you do a bit of research on the history of Palestinians in Gaza. I would also point out that Hamas has no reason to deny aid for Palestinian people. Over 1,000 Palestinians, I believe many more than this as of right now, many of whom are minors, are currently being held in Israeli prisons without charge, trial, or adequate legal representation. They have no hope of release. As I understand it, the whole point of taking hostages was to negotiate a prisoner exchange so that these people could be free. In what way would withholding aid benefit Hamas? And before you condemn Hamas, I ask you to take another look at the long and horrific history of Israeli occupation and ask yourself what you would do in the same situation. I would also point out that getting aid past a blockade is meaningless if bombs are still falling and people's homes and hospitals are reduced to rubble, which is true in many areas of Gaza. And it does not change the fact that Palestinian people are living in the largest open-air prison in the world under a state of apartheid. The murder of Israeli civilians on October 7th was horrific, and the ongoing global rise of anti-Semitism is unconscionable. Holding Jewish people responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, however, is unjust, as is holding Palestinians responsible for the murder of Israeli civilians. Everyone deserves to be safe from violence and discrimination. This is an act of retaliation, not defense. This is not war. This is aggression against Palestinian civilians that have no ability to defend themselves against constant bombardment and violent assault. The footage I have witnessed from Gaza and the West Bank is horrific, and the default, "What about Hamas?" that I hear repeated by everyone, including my MP, is a cop-out weaponized by people who are looking for an excuse to deflect blame away from the Israeli government. I am going to share an address by Irish politician Deputy Matt Carthy, who has the integrity to speak up for what is right, something I desperately wish Canadian politicians would do. I would ask Dr. Ellis to listen to what Matt Carthy has to say and ask if he can honestly stand by his previous arguments in light of this.
Cancora, let us be very clear. Hamas breached international law on the 7th of October. Hamas targeted innocent civilians in the most callous and inhumane manner, and their actions have been rightly condemned by right-thinking people across the world. But we should also be very clear. Israel has breached international law. Not just on every day since October the 7th, but virtually every single day for decades. Israel occupies Palestinian land against international law. Israel blockades Palestinian territory against international law. Israel builds and expands illegal settlements against international law. Israel enforces an apartheid system that restricts the movements of Palestinians and denies their fundamental rights against international law. And Israel regularly and systematically attacks and kills Palestinian civilians against international law. So the question that must be answered by all of us in political life is this: how does the world respond to flagrant abuses of international law? When it comes to the horrendous war crimes of Hamas, the response was very clear and very consistent. World leaders queued up to say Israel has the right to defend itself. One after another repeated the words, the great and the good, including our government: Israel has the right to defend itself. Repeated in statement after statement, tweet after tweet, despite the full knowledge that those words have become contaminated. The words "Israel has the right to defend itself" means in practice that Israel takes that right as licence to bombard civilians, to bomb schools, hospitals and other civilian infrastructure. And it has now been taken as licence to enforce the displacement of 1 million people from one end of an open-air prison to another, to deny food, energy, medical supplies to a besieged civilian population, to actually deny them water, to ensure that children, the sick, the disabled, the elderly will literally die of thirst. Israel has the right to defend itself has now become cover for Israel has the right to commit genocide right in front of our eyes. How come we never hear the words "Palestine has the right to defend itself"? Not when a humanitarian flotilla bringing essential supplies to Gaza is met with a military assault and the murder by Israel of 9 unarmed activists. Not when Palestinians march in peaceful protest against a legal blockade and are met again with a military assault and the murder of 300 of them. Not after the countless bombings of Gaza by Israeli forces. Not even when Israel targeted and murdered 4 little Palestinian boys playing football on a beach. And not when Palestinians were dragged from their homes and forced to watch as those homes were destroyed to allow for new illegal Israeli settlements on lands that are clearly defined in international law as part of Palestine. And not after the countless offensive attacks by Israel against the people of Gaza or the West Bank have we or heard anybody in this House or any Western leader utter the words "Palestine has the right to defend itself." And why not? And by the way, I'm not asking you to say those words. And in fact, it's just as well you don't. Because we all know that the people of Palestine can't defend themselves. Not against one of the most powerful military forces in the world that is backed up by even more powerful military forces. The truth is that the people of Palestine, just like the innocent people of Israel, don't need the international community to tell them that their leaders have the right to inflict more bombings, more pain, more suffering. They need the international community to say stop, to say release the hostages, to say stop the bombings, the siege, the slaughter. They need the international community to tell Israel to stop the blockade, stop the apartheid, stop the annexation, to stop the genocide. And they need countries, Taoiseach, to lead the way. And Ireland should be one of those countries that leads the way. We know colonialism, we know oppression, we know conflict, but we also know conflict resolution. We know peace building, we know nation building. And because of what we know, what our history has taught us, our call tonight must be clear. Immediate, full and unequivocal ceasefires and a decisive international intervention that leads to negotiations and to a lasting and just peace settlement. And to, at long last, to a free, sovereign and independent Palestine.
Ireland is one of the few countries with the courage and conviction to stand on the right side of history. I am deeply ashamed that Canada refuses to do the same. There is nothing that justifies this level of violence, and I am horrified by the dehumanization I have witnessed on the part of politicians and mainstream media towards the Palestinian people. I have included a link in my bio to an article written by Palestinian-American writer, clinical psychologist, and professor Dr. Hala Alyan, detailing the lack of empathy and compassion showed towards the Palestinian people. I encourage you to please read it. I don't know if my MP is grossly uninformed or willfully ignorant, but in the end, I don't think it's either of those things. Politicians have picked a side and are selecting the arguments that support their position. I'm sure many of you have seen the footage of Joe Biden back in 1986 during a U.S. Senate session stating, "It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel." It all boils down to power and control. Canada and the US have a very shameful history when it comes to the treatment of Jewish refugees and citizens leading up to and during the Second World War, another case in which genocide was occurring and we turned a blind eye. As Canadians, we have a responsibility to speak up, to make ourselves heard, and show some honesty and integrity in the face of genocide. We try to adopt some kind of moral superiority when it comes to our neighbors down south, but time and again, we've proven ourselves to be no better. We just have better PR. We have our own ongoing history of genocide towards First Nations people, many of whom still do not have access to clean drinking water, whose children are being forcibly removed from them, who face disproportionately high and unjust levels of incarceration, and whose women, girls, and two-spirited community are being murdered as the government blatantly refuses to support the Indigenous community and keep them safe. Search the Landfill and Land Back are two essential movements that have been largely ignored or used as a party platform to run against by politicians. There is no pride in genocide, not in our support of Israel bombing Palestine, and definitely not here in our home on stolen Indigenous land. If you have been getting your news from mainstream media, I suggest you diversify your sources. I am including a list of Palestinian journalists and media sources below. Instagram has been actively removing accounts like Eye on Palestine, but Al Jazeera is an excellent Palestinian news source that you can reference off of social media, especially here in Canada, where news is inaccessible on Facebook and Instagram. I believe it's important to get your news directly from the source in as unbiased a way as possible. As I said earlier, the recent release of 2 Israeli hostages blatantly displays the media bias at work right now. Sarah Jama, former NDP MPP in Hamilton, is one of the few politicians brave enough and with enough integrity to speak up, and she has been kicked out of the NDP caucus and banned from speaking in the chamber. This is despicable but sadly unsurprising. We supposedly live in the true north strong and free, but the reality is the exact opposite. We are weak in the face of genocide both at home and abroad, and anyone who dares speak truth to power is silenced, doxxed, and faces losing their employment. Sarah Jama is one of many Canadians experiencing this, along with a medical doctor and many other people, many of whom are BIPOC. I lost my pride in being Canadian long ago, but I have never been so ashamed. It is way past time for us to speak up and do what is right. There is no argument that can justify the horrific violence and dehumanization that is occurring right in front of our eyes. This is genocide, and we are standing by while it happens with our support. We need to contact our representatives and demand that as our proxy in the Canadian government, they could take a stand to push for ceasefire and lift the siege on Palestinian people.